Hello everybody. Today we are going to start our lecture number 2 on the database systems. So the title of this lecture is Modeling Data in the Organization. It's a very important topic and the first step towards the actual practical database development, which is basically design and development of the data layer of information systems. So in today's lecture, we shall try to understand the basic foundation of the conceptual design, which basically is the first design whenever we intend to have a database-based system. So this is the agenda of this lecture. We shall be discussing the entity relationship modeling. And this entity relationship modeling basically is the conceptual design of the data layer of information system, which means that we will be designing the data structure which would be used in order to store the data in an information system. So these basically are the building blocks of this entity relationship diagram or the entity relationship model. So the first concept or the first building block of an entity relationship model is the concept of entities. And this concept further is divided in two parts. One is the entity type and the other is entity instance. So let us discuss these two concepts one by one. Basically, this concept entity type and entity instance can be visualized as the concept or can be seen as an equivalent to the concept of class and object in the object-oriented paradigm. Just like we have objects in the real world and we represent those objects in objects while we write a program in an object-oriented language, same like that, whenever we intend to have a stored representation of those objects, we may represent them using entity instance concept, which means that they are actually stored as entity instances. And their type, just like we have the objects belonging to a type, which basically is the type of the class, just like that in entity relationship modeling, those instances, those entity instances, they belong to entity types. So this is one way of visualizing the concept of entities. Another concept is that whenever we intend to design the data structure of the database, we need to identify all of the objects whose data is to be stored in the database. So in order to do that, we shall be basically we shall try to recognize all of the objects whose data is to be stored. Okay, for example, let's take an example of a classroom. For example, we intend to have a database for a classroom. So we shall be identifying all of the objects which are there in the classroom and whose data is to be stored. This thing is also very important because we might be having many objects, but we may not be interested in storing data of all of them. For example, in a classroom, for example, a faculty member is teaching. Okay, so faculty member is an object. Similarly, the students who are attending the lecture, they are also objects and they are basically objects of the student class. And similarly, the course or the subject which is being taught by the faculty member to the students, that also is an object whose data is to be stored. So for example, primarily we want to store the record or the data of this lecture delivery system, and we are not interested in the other objects because there are other objects in the classroom as well. For example, furniture is there, for example, computers are there, for example, the projector is there, the writing pens are there, and so many other objects are there. But for example, we are only interested to store the data of this lecture delivery. So which means that we are only interested in storing the students' data and the faculty's data and the subject's data. So as per this definition, the entities or the entity types that would be recognized in this system, they would be faculty member and student and the subject. So the types are faculty member and student and subject, and these types have been identified with the help of the objects which are there. For example, the teacher which is teaching there, that teacher is basically an instance of the teacher class. So teacher would be modeled as an entity type with the help of this actual teacher who is teaching there. He or she is basically the entity instance, and with the help of that instance, we have identified his or her type, and that is a faculty member. Similarly, the students who are sitting over there, they are objects. If we talk about real world or the object-oriented paradigm, they are objects, but in terms of a database system, they are entity instances because they are there and they are included in the process that we want to model and whose data we want to store. And with the help of these instances, we have identified that they belong to a class or a group or a type, and that type is students. Okay. And similarly, the subject that is being taught there, for example, the faculty member is teaching the database course. That database is an entity instance. Like we can model this database as an object in the object-oriented paradigm. But here it would be modeled as an entity instance. And with the help of this instance, we have identified the type of this instance, and that type is a subject. So from the actual teacher who is teaching there, with the help of that, we have identified the faculty class, and with the help of the students who are there sitting there and taking the lecture, we have modeled or we have identified the students class and the course that is being taught there. With the help of that instance, we have identified the group or type of that course, and that is subject. So basically, I can say that a faculty member is teaching a course to students. So in this sentence, I can identify that faculty member is an entity type, which is equivalent to a class, and the subject that faculty member is teaching, that subject is also a class or an entity type in the entity relationship modeling. And the students to whom that course is being taught, the group or the type of those students is student, and this would be also modeled as the entity type, and in the object-oriented paradigm, it would be modeled as a class. So basically, these concepts, they are equivalent to the concepts of class and object in the object-oriented paradigm. So to summarize this concept of entity, number one, the instances or the objects which are there and whose data we want to store in the database, they would be identified, and then their types would be identified, because basically while we are designing the data structure would be designed in the classes or the groups or the types. So those types which have been identified or which would be detected, those would be referred to as the entity types. And these types, they will be identified or detected with the help of the instances which are there. So this is the summary of an entity type and the entity instance. So the first thing that we need to detect and we need to model while modeling the entity relationship diagram are the entities and the types. So entity type is basically a concept, just like we have the concept of a class, or the if you can say that just like a type, because the type does not have a physical existence. Okay, so for example, if I ask you what is the name of a student, you won't be able to answer this question. You'll ask me that about whom you're talking. And if I specify you a student or a teacher, then yes, you can tell me that this is the name of this teacher or student, and this is the age, and these are the other values of the variables of that object. But when I ask you the values of a type, you won't be able to answer me because the type does not have a physical existence. Okay, so similarly, in entity instances and in entity types, the type is not actually referring to an object. The purpose of type is just to represent that group. Okay, so that does not have a physical existence, just like a class. But the instances, they do have a physical existence because they actually are the representation of actual real world objects. So for example, if I refer you to a physical actually sitting student, for example XYZ, then you'll say yes, that XYZ physically exists in the world, and while in the data world, the representation of that XYZ would be there. Okay, so this thing is a bit tricky, but you can always come back to me if there is any confusion on my email, if you need some more clarification or discussion. So anyways, the next concept that is there in the entity relationship modeling, which comes after the entities, identification of entities and entity types and instances, is the relationship. This relationship is basically the logical association or the association between multiple objects, okay, which is there and in which we are interested, okay, because while we are designing the data layer of an information system, we basically are trying to record the execution of processes which are being run in an organization. For example, I just gave you the example of this lecture delivery in a class. So this lecture delivery is a process that is being executed in a class. So actually we are trying to store the data of this lecture delivery, okay? So in order to store the data, where we have detected the entity instances and entity types, we need to identify the logical connections or the associations which are there between these objects. For example, if we just see the same example of lecture delivery, we can identify the logical relationships. For example, I said to you that a teacher is teaching a course to students, okay? So we can see that there is a relationship of faculty with the course, that a faculty member is teaching a course, and then there is a relationship of course with students, that is the students, they are learning the course. So basically we have identified 3 entity instances and 3 entity types based on those instances. They are faculty and student and course, and then we have identified the relationships between these instances and these types. So for example, I can say that a faculty member is teaching a course. So teaching is basically the relationship that connects the faculty and the subject in this particular domain or in this particular scope, okay? And similarly, there is a relationship between the subject and the students, and that is students, they are learning the course. So this learning is the relationship which is there. So we need to identify all such relationships which are there. Now there are 2 concepts. One is the relationship type and the other is relationship instance. So if we're viewing that relationship at the entity types level, for example, I said you that there is a relationship between teacher and faculty, because teacher is an entity type and faculty or teacher is an entity type and the subject is an entity type. So while we are trying to model this relationship between 2 entity types, then this relationship type would be a relationship type. Similarly, learning, while learning is visualized or is modeled at the entity types level, for example, when I say that students are learning the subject, so the relationship, basically we are trying to model the relationship at the entity types level, then it would be referred to as relationship type. And the same relationship, when we will try to model the same relationship at the instances level, for example, if I say that XYZ is teaching database, now on both sides the relationship is same, teaching, but on the both sides of teaching there are 2 instances. On one side there is an instance of faculty XYZ, and on the other side there is an instance of the course, which is database. So now this relationship teaching is no more a relationship type. Now it is a relationship instance, because at this level we are trying to visualize this relationship between 2 entity instances. Similarly, if I say that ABC is learning the database course, now this learning course, now this learning relationship is no more a relationship type, rather it is a relationship instance, because we are now modeling this relationship at the instance level. So this is the second building block of entity relationship model that needs to be identified. Okay, so whenever we are designing the conceptual level design of the data layer of an information system, and we are using the entity relationship diagram, this is the second thing that we need to identify and detect in our model. The third thing that we need to model are the attributes. So I'm trying to close my lectures in 15 minutes. So I shall discuss the concept of attributes in the next part, inshallah. Thank you very much.